sound of a coffee pot percolating, the soft shuffle of slippers on a wooden floor, the gentle hum of a refrigerator. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the streets of East Austin are dead silent. The world is asleep, but in a small white house on Hamilton Avenue, the day has already begun. A 112-year-old man stands in his kitchen, bathed in the soft yellow glow of a single light bulb. His hands, weathered by a century of labor and war, move with a slow, deliberate purpose. It is a scene of perfect, fragile peace, a domestic sanctuary that seems untouched by time. Abrupt cut, the deafening roar of mortar shells, machine gun fire, screams of men in the jungle, high-pitched ringing tone, but the silence is a lie. Inside his mind, the noise never truly stops. The peace of the kitchen is constantly threatened by the memories of Pearl Harbor, Okinawa, and Iwo Jima, the ghosts of the Pacific Theater that have followed him home for 70 years. Cut back to silence, the crisp crack of a bottle cap, the glug, glug, lug of liquid pouring, a deep exhale, and then the ghosts recede. He doesn't reach for a blood pressure medication. He doesn't reach for a multivitamin. He reaches for a bottle of whiskey. He pours a generous tablespoon into his steaming black coffee, stirs it slowly, and takes a sip. Doctors told him it would kill him, but the secret wasn't in the pill bottle. It was in the coffee cup. Richard Overton was a medical anomaly, a statistical impossibility, and a walking contradiction to everything modern science tells us about longevity. In an era obsessed with green juices, intermittent fasting, and gym memberships, Richard was the man who broke every rule and outlived the rule makers. He smoked 12 cigars a day, but never got cancer. He ate fried catfish, corn dogs, and butter pecan ice cream every night, yet his heart kept beating strong for over 40,000 days. He drove his Ford pickup truck through the chaotic Texas traffic until he was 106 years old, navigating the modern world with the same steady hands that once held a sniper rifle. But of all his habits, none was more legendary or more baffling to the medical community than his morning ritual. To the average person, starting the day with whiskey at 3 a.m. sounds like a recipe for disaster. To a doctor, it sounds like alcoholism. But to Richard Overton, it was fuel. He didn't drink to get drunk, he drank to get moving. He claimed it kept his muscles warm, a simple, folksy explanation that hid a profound physiological and psychological truth. This was a man who had seen the world end in 1941. He had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and come out the other side with a smile on his face and a cigar in his mouth. He understood something that the textbooks miss, that stress is the real killer, and that joy, however unhealthy it may look on paper, is the ultimate preservative. Over the next 90 minutes, we are going to pull up a chair at Richard's kitchen table. We are going beyond the viral headlines and the funny sound bites to investigate the chemistry of a survivor. We will look at the decades of history that shaped this morning routine, from the segregated South of his youth to the bloody beaches of the Pacific, and finally to the quiet porch where he became an American icon. We will explore the irony of a man who buried his doctors, the man who refused to let the trauma of war steal his ability to enjoy a simple cup of coffee. This is not just a story about a drink. It is a story about defiance. It is the story of how Richard Overton looked death in the eye, raised a cup of spiked coffee, and told the reaper he would have to wait a little longer. Welcome to the morning ritual of the oldest veteran in America. The hour of 3 in the morning is a liminal space. It is too late for the night owls, and too early for the early birds. It is a time of deep silence, a vacuum in the rhythm of the modern world, where the only sounds are the settling of house foundations and the hum of street lights. For most people, waking at this hour is a sign of insomnia or anxiety. For Richard Overton, it was his sanctuary. His day did not begin with the jarring alarm of a smartphone or the morning news. It began with a biological clock set to a rhythm that had been ticking for over a century. He would rise from his bed in the dark, his movements slow but fluid, navigating the hallways of the home he built in 1945 with the muscle memory of a man who knew every creak in the floorboards. This house was not just a structure. It was a time capsule, a physical extension of his own history, filled with the scent of old wood, tobacco, and memories. The first witnesses to his awakening were not people, but his cats. In the solitude of the pre-dawn darkness, they were his company, his platoon. They would be waiting for him, weaving between his legs as he shuffled toward the kitchen, demanding their breakfast before he had even thought of his own. There was a gentleness in how he treated them, a softness that contrasted with the hardness of his history. He would feed them first, speaking to them in low, murmuring tones, a morning prayer of sorts delivered to strays. This connection was vital. At 112, many of his human contemporaries were gone, but life still demanded his attention. The cats needed him, and that need gave him a reason to put his feet on the floor. Once the animals were fed, the ritual turned inward. He would move to the stove, the centerpiece of his laboratory. The kitchen was modest, devoid of the stainless steel gadgets and espresso machines that clutter modern countertops. It was a space of utility. He would prepare his coffee, usually a standard, unpretentious brand, brewed strong and hot. But coffee alone was just caffeine. It was incomplete. To transform the black liquid into the elixir that powered the oldest veteran in America, it required the alchemy of the secret ingredient. He would reach for the bottle of whiskey. It was rarely a top-shelf single-malt Scotch aged in oak barrels for 30 years. Richard was a practical man. It was often a simple, affordable bourbon, the kind of spirit that bites the back of the throat. He didn't use a measuring jigger. He didn't weigh the ounces. He poured by feel, a splash that amounted to a generous tablespoon or two, swirling the amber spirit into the steaming darkness of the cup. Then came the sugar plenty of it. He had a sweet tooth that defied the warnings of every dentist and dietitian in the country. He would stir the concoction, the spoon clinking against the ceramic, a bell tolling the start of the day. This beverage was a physiological paradox, a depressant mixed with a stimulant, sugar mixed with bitterness. But to Richard, it wasn't a cocktail. It was a necessity. When asked why he did this, Richard offered a justification that was as scientifically dubious as it was intuitively brilliant. "It keeps my muscles warm," he would say. To the medical mind, this is nonsense. Alcohol dilates blood vessels, which can actually lower body temperature. But Richard wasn't speaking the language of textbooks. He was speaking the language of the body. At his age, circulation slows down. The joints stiffen. The morning air feels colder than it used to. The whiskey provided an immediate artificial flush of heat, a kickstart to the engine. It loosened the stiffness in his shoulders and back, the phantom pains of a century of living. It was a liquid sweater wrapped around his insides, preparing him to face the day. He would take that cup and sit, often by the window or on the porch if the weather allowed, and simply exist. This was the most crucial part of the ritual. He wasn't rushing to check emails. He wasn't worrying about the stock market. He was sipping his whiskey coffee and watching the world wake up. In those quiet hours between 3 a.m. and sunrise, Richard Overton was the king of his own domain. The atmosphere of the kitchen, with its vintage linoleum and the smell of sweet coffee and tobacco, was a fortress against the chaos of the outside world. There was a profound simplicity to it. While the rest of the world was obsessing over kale shakes and biohacking to live longer, Richard was proving that perhaps the secret to longevity wasn't in optimizing every cell, but in satisfying the soul. The warmth spreading through his chest wasn't just the whiskey. It was the satisfaction of a man who had survived the worst the world could throw at him, and was now free to start his day exactly how he damn well pleased. If you were to take the daily routine of Richard Overton and present it blindly to a board of cardiologists, oncologists, and nutritionists, the prognosis would be unanimous and grim. They would look at the data points: 12 cigars a day, daily consumption of whiskey, a diet high in fried foods and sugar, and a complete lack of cardiovascular exercise in his later years, and they would predict a lifespan cut short by heart disease, lung cancer, or stroke. By all the laws of modern medical science, Richard Overton should not have lived to be 112. He should have been a cautionary tale. Instead, he became a medical miracle, a statistical outlier that frustrated the textbooks and delighted the public. The central conflict of his later life was not against a foreign enemy or a personal demon, but against the well-meaning advice of the medical establishment. It was a quiet war between the rigid rules of science and the stubborn vitality of a man who simply refused to die. For decades, Richard sat in examination rooms listening to men in white coats tell him what he was doing wrong. The conversations followed a predictable script. A doctor, looking at Richard's chart with concern, would lean in and gently suggest that perhaps it was time to cut back on the Tampa sweets. They would warn him about the carcinogenic properties of tobacco, the strain of caffeine on the aging heart, and the liver damage associated with daily whiskey consumption. Richard would listen politely. He was a Southern gentleman, after all. He respected authority and titles. He would nod, say, "Yes, sir," and "I understand, doctor." Then he would walk out of the clinic, get into his truck, drive home, and light a cigar on his porch. He didn't ignore them out of ignorance. He ignored them out of intuition. He knew his body better than they did. He knew that the cigars relaxed him and the whiskey warmed him. To remove them would be to remove the very things that made life worth living, and Richard suspected that misery killed a man faster than smoke ever could. There is a dark, comedic tragedy in the timeline of Richard's medical history, a phenomenon that can only be described as the cemetery of doctors. Over the course of his 112 years, Richard Overton didn't just ignore his doctors. He outlasted them. There is a famous story he liked to tell, with a mischievous glint in his eye, about a physician who was particularly adamant that Richard quit smoking when he was in his late 90s. The doctor warned him that if he didn't put down the cigars, he wouldn't see his next birthday. 5 years later, that doctor passed away. Richard, meanwhile, was still on his porch, smoking the same brand of cigars. This happened more than once. He became the patient who attended his doctor's funerals. It was the ultimate silent rebuttal to their advice. "They died," he would say simply, "and I'm still here." It wasn't arrogance, it was just a fact. The men who spent their lives studying how to live long often succumbed to the stress and ailments of mortality, while the man who broke every rule kept waking up at 3 a.m. for his spiked coffee. Perhaps the most striking visual contrast in this medical standoff was the medicine cabinet. In the homes of most supercentenarians, people who live past 110, you will usually find a small pharmacy. There are pill organizers filled with statins for cholesterol, beta blockers for blood pressure, blood thinners, and supplements for bone density. The maintenance of an extreme old age usually requires a complex chemical scaffolding. Richard Overton's regimen was different. While he did see doctors and undoubtedly had some medical care, his daily pharmacy looked like the inventory of a liquor store. His blood pressure medication was the relaxation of the porch. His antidepressant was the butter pecan ice cream. His vasodilator was the whiskey. He famously claimed, "I don't take no medicine," a statement that, while perhaps not 100% literally true in his final days, was spiritually accurate. He refused to be pathologized. He refused to view his old age as a condition to be treated. This brings us to the great scientific mystery. Was it nature or nurture? Geneticists would argue that Richard won the genetic lottery. There is undeniable evidence that some human beings possess a FOXO3 gene or other biological markers that protect them from the ravages of aging and bad habits. These are the people who can smoke and drink without cellular consequences. Richard was likely one of these genetic supermen. But to dismiss his longevity purely as DNA is to miss the psychological component. There is a growing school of thought that stress cortisol is the most toxic substance the body produces. Stress causes inflammation, weakens the immune system, and damages the heart. Richard Overton, by all accounts, was a man with a cortisol level of 0. The whiskey in his coffee wasn't just a drink, it was a tool for stress management. By refusing to worry about his health, by refusing to stress about the dangers of his habits, he may have protected his body more effectively than any diet could. He lived in a state of perpetual, chemically assisted chill. In the battle between medical science and Richard Overton, science had all the facts. But Richard had the last laugh, proving that sometimes the will to enjoy life is the strongest medicine of all. To understand why Richard Overton put whiskey in his coffee at the age of 112, we have to rewind the clock to 1945. The habit was not the eccentric whim of a senile old man. It was a relic, a fossilized survival mechanism brought home from the theater of war. When Richard stepped off the transport ship and returned to Austin, Texas, he was 39 years old. He had left as a furniture worker and returned as a veteran of the deadliest conflict in human history. In 1945, the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder did not exist. There were no support groups, no VA therapy sessions, and no prescriptions for anti-anxiety medication. Men were expected to take off their uniforms, bury their memories, and go back to work as if they hadn't just spent years dodging mortar fire and clearing bodies from harbors. But the mind remembers, and for millions of veterans like Richard, the silence of the post-war world was deafening. Alcohol, specifically whiskey, became the unofficial medication of the greatest generation. It was the accessible therapist, the liquid barrier between the nightmares of the Pacific and the reality of civilian life. The ritual of the morning whiskey likely found its roots in this transitional period. Waking up in the dark hours before the rest of the world was a common symptom among combat veterans who retained the hypervigilance of the front line. In those solitary hours before dawn, when the mind is most vulnerable to flashbacks, a splash of whiskey and hot coffee acted as a stabilizer. It dulled the sharp edges of the memories. It provided a chemical signal to the nervous system that it was okay to stand down, that the perimeter was secure. Over the decades, what might have started as a coping mechanism calcified into a lifestyle. It ceased to be about forgetting the war and simply became about starting the day. It was a habit forged in trauma that matured into a ritual of comfort, spanning 73 years of consistent practice. This habit was also deeply rooted in the soil of his geography. Richard was a Texan, and in the mid-century South, whiskey was not merely an intoxicant. It was a cultural staple. It was the drink of the working man, the fuel of the juke joints, and the currency of social bonding. Austin in the 1950s was a segregated city, a place of hard lines and hard labor. Richard worked in furniture warehouses, lifting heavy loads in the stifling Texas heat. In this environment, whiskey was viewed differently than it is in today's wellness-obsessed culture. It was seen as a restorative tonic. Old-timers believed it thinned the blood, cured colds, and eased the aches of physical labor. By drinking it, Richard was participating in a regional tradition that valued grit and resilience. He wasn't drinking wine or fancy cocktails. He was drinking bourbon, a spirit made from corn, as American and unpretentious as the Ford trucks he drove. If we look at the sheer mathematics of his consumption, the numbers are staggering. Consistency was the hallmark of Richard Overton's life. He wasn't a binge drinker who lost weekends to blackouts. He was a microdoser of massive proportions. If we conservatively estimate that he consumed just 2 to 3 ounces of whiskey a day between his morning coffee and his evening glass multiplied by 365 days, multiplied by the 70-plus years he maintained this routine, we are looking at a river of liquor. Richard processed hundreds of gallons of whiskey through his liver. The consistency is what baffles medical experts. The body usually breaks down under such a sustained assault, developing cirrhosis or failure. Yet Richard's system adapted. He built a tolerance that was structural, integrating the alcohol into his metabolism as if it were just another food group. It became a caloric baseline, a part of his physiology as essential as water. But how does a man who worked in a furniture store and lived through the Great Depression afford a lifetime supply of whiskey and cigars? This brings us to the economic genius of Richard Overton. He was a man of profound financial discipline. The secret ingredient was funded by a lifestyle of extreme frugality in every other area. Richard famously paid $4,000 cash for his house on Hamilton Avenue in 1945. He never carried a mortgage. He never paid a dime of interest to a bank. He didn't believe in credit cards, calling them a trap. "I pay cash for everything," he would say. If he couldn't afford it, he didn't buy it. He drove his trucks for decades, fixing them himself, refusing to succumb to the consumerist urge to upgrade every few years. By opting out of the modern debt cycle, Richard freed up his disposable income for the things that actually brought in joy. He wasn't spending money on interest rates. He was spending it on Tampa sweet cigars and bottles of bourbon. He prioritized his pleasures. He viewed his morning whiskey not as a luxury, but as a utility bill, a fixed cost of living that was necessary for his operation. In his mind, investing in his own happiness and stress reduction was the smartest purchase he could make. He watched neighbors buy expensive cars on credit and stress themselves into early graves, working to pay them off. Meanwhile, Richard sat on his paid-off porch, sipping his paid-off whiskey, compounding interest in the currency of time. His economic philosophy was the foundation that allowed the habit to exist. He proved that you don't need to be rich to live like a king. You just need to know what you want and refuse to pay for what you don't. The whiskey and the coffee was the dividend of a life lived without debt, a daily reward for a man who had mastered the art of being free. If we peel back the layers of Richard Overton's physiology, looking past the scarred lungs and the liver that processed 70 years of bourbon, we arrive at the true mechanism of his longevity. It was not the alcohol itself. Chemically, ethanol is a poison. It damages cells and dehydrates the body. If the secret were merely in the bottle, every alcoholic in America would live to be a centenarian, and we know that is tragedy, not truth. The secret ingredient was not the whiskey, but the philosophy that the whiskey represented. It was a tangible, liquid manifestation of a state of being that scientists call homeostasis, and Richard called living. The real killer of the modern man is not always cholesterol or carcinogens, it is cortisol. It is the stress hormone that floods our systems when we are anxious, angry, or afraid. It keeps the body in a state of chronic inflammation, wearing down the gears of the heart and the immune system until they snap. Richard Overton, by some miracle of temperament or discipline, lived his life in a cortisol vacuum. He had mastered the art of zero stress. To understand this fearlessness, we must return to the source of his trauma. When a man has stood on the shores of Pearl Harbor and watched the water turn red, or crouched in a foxhole in Iwo Jima while the world exploded around him, his baseline for fear is permanently recalibrated. The things that keep the average modern human awake at night: unpaid bills, traffic jams, political arguments, social media likes, were rendered comically insignificant to Richard. He had seen the apocalypse. He had seen the worst thing that could possibly happen. Once you have survived the end of the world, everything else is just a bonus. Every sunrise is a gift. Every breath is a victory. The whiskey in his morning coffee was a daily toast to this survival. It was his way of acknowledging that the bullet didn't get him, that the bomb missed, and that he was still here, warm and alive, while so many of his brothers were gone. It wasn't a drink of addiction. It was a drink of celebration. He was drinking to the fact that he was invincible until God said otherwise. Consider the modern obsession with health. We live in an era where people are terrified of dying. We have hikers who eat only organic kale, runners who track every heartbeat on smartwatches, and executives who biohack their sleep cycles. Yet, walk into any doctor's office, and you will find these same people suffering from hypertension, anxiety disorders, and ulcers. They are doing everything right, but they are miserable. They are fighting death so hard that they forget to live. Their bodies are flooded with the stress of trying to be healthy. Richard Overton represented the antithesis of this anxiety. He sat on his porch, a rebel king in a trucker hat, consuming the very things that were supposed to kill him, and he did it with a smile that disarmed the reaper. He proved that the placebo effect of happiness might be more potent than the chemical effect of a vegetable. By refusing to worry about his health, he inadvertently protected it. He didn't spike his cortisol levels worrying about the sugar in his ice cream or the alcohol in his cup. He simply enjoyed them. And in that enjoyment, his body found a rhythm of relaxation that allowed it to repair and endure. This philosophy extended beyond the chemistry of his diet and into the architecture of his social life. Loneliness is a killer. Medical studies have shown that social isolation is as damaging to the human body as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It shrinks the brain and weakens the heart. Richard Overton, despite living alone after the death of his wife, was never isolated. His morning whiskey was often a solitary ritual, but his evening glass was a communal one. His front porch on Hamilton Avenue was not a barrier between him and the world. It was a stage. It was a community center. Neighbors, friends, reporters, and strangers would stop by. He would offer them a seat. He would offer them a drink. The whiskey was the lubricant of connection. It broke down walls. It turned strangers into friends. He sat there for hours, watching the cars go by, waving at the school bus, engaging with humanity. He was deeply embedded in the fabric of his neighborhood. He loved people, and people loved him back. That exchange of energy, the laughter, the storytelling, the flirting with the nurses who came to check on him released oxytocin and dopamine, the neurochemicals of connection and pleasure. These are the natural antidotes to cortisol. While other elderly men withered away in nursing homes, staring at televisions in silence, Richard was holding court. He was active. He was engaged. The whiskey in his hand was a signal that he was open for business, ready to talk, ready to listen, ready to be part of the living world. He didn't retreat from life as he aged. He leaned into it, glass in hand. And then there was the cigar. If the whiskey was the fuel, the cigar was the regulator. His technique was specific and metaphorical. He never inhaled. "I just taste it," he would say, and blow it out. He smoked 12 a day, letting the smoke fill his mouth, tasting the sweetness of the tobacco, and then releasing it into the air. He never let it drag down into his lungs. This was more than just a way to avoid lung cancer. It was a perfect metaphor for how he handled the troubles of life. Richard tasted the world. He experienced the bitterness of segregation, the acrid smoke of war, the grief of losing a wife, and the pain of outliving his friends. He tasted it all, but he never inhaled it. He never let the bitterness settle inside him and rot his soul. He didn't hold grudges. He didn't nurse resentments. He didn't let the toxicity of the world enter his bloodstream. He tasted the trouble, acknowledged it, and then blew it out, watching it drift away like the blue smoke from his Tampa suite. This is the zero-stress theory of Richard Overton. The secret ingredient in his coffee wasn't just a cheap bourbon. It was the absolute refusal to let the world break his spirit. It was the audacity to find comfort in a cup while the rest of the world ran around in a panic. He understood that the body listens to the mind. If the mind says we are safe, we are warm, we are happy, the body responds by thriving. If the mind says we are in danger, we are lacking, we are afraid, the body responds by dying. Richard told his body every single morning at 3 a.m. that life was good. He told his muscles to be warm. He told his spirit to wake up. And for 112 years his body listened. He was a master of his own internal atmosphere, a man who created a microclimate of peace in a kitchen in East Austin, fueled by sugar, caffeine, and alcohol, but sustained by a fearless, unshakable love for the act of being alive. The common assumption when hearing about a man who starts his day with whiskey before dawn is that the rest of the day must be a blur of intoxication and lethargy. We imagine the stereotypical drinker stumbling through the hours impaired and slow. But to view Richard Overton through this lens is to fundamentally misunderstand his biology. The whiskey in his coffee did not act as a sedative. It acted as a catalyst. It was the spark plug for a machine that had been running for over a century. By the time the sun actually rose over East Austin, illuminating the dew on the grass of Hamilton Avenue, Richard was not going back to bed. He was gearing up. The alcohol had metabolized, the caffeine had kicked in, and the warm muscles he spoke of were ready to be put to use. The hours between dawn and dusk were not spent in a rocking chair waiting for the end. They were spent in active, defiant motion. For most people, the act of driving a car is a mundane necessity, a chore to be endured during a commute. For Richard Overton, it was the ultimate expression of his autonomy. Until he was well past the age of 100, Richard was still climbing behind the wheel of his beloved Ford F-100 pickup truck. This was not a modern vehicle with lane assist sensors, backup cameras, and heated seats that practically drive themselves. It was an old-school truck, a beast of steel and chrome that required physical effort to operate. The steering was heavy, the brakes required a firm foot, and the visibility relied on the driver turning his head, not looking at a screen. That a man of his age could physically command such a machine is impressive enough, but the fact that the state of Texas legally allowed him to do so is the true testament to his condition. He renewed his driver's license when he was over 100 years old. Imagine the scene at the Department of Motor Vehicles. A centenarian standing in line, passing the eye exam, passing the written test, and proving to the state troopers that his reflexes were sharp enough to handle the chaotic roads of Austin. He didn't drive because he had nowhere else to be. He drove because he refused to be a passenger in his own life. He famously distrusted other drivers, often complaining that they drove crazy. In his mind, he was the safest pair of hands on the road. He had navigated the jungles of the Pacific without getting shot. He could certainly navigate a trip to the grocery store without getting hit. The whiskey he drank hours earlier didn't impair his judgment. If anything, his confidence behind the wheel suggested a state of heightened focus. Driving gave him agency. It meant he didn't have to wait for a caretaker to take him to church or to the store to buy his cat food. As long as he had the keys to that Ford, he was a free man, independent of the nursing home system that claimed so many of his peers. When he wasn't patrolling the streets in his truck, Richard was patrolling his property. He had built the house on Hamilton Avenue in 1945, and for 70 years he was its sole custodian. He didn't hire a landscaping crew to manicure his lawn. He did it himself. Neighbors would often look out their windows to see a man born in 1906 pushing a lawnmower under the blazing Texas sun. He swept his own driveway, a rhythmic, meditative task that he performed with military precision. There was not a single leaf allowed to settle on his concrete. This physical labor was the furnace where he burned off the calories of his diet. The sugar from the ice cream and the alcohol from the whiskey were not stored as fat. They were converted into kinetic energy. This constant movement was crucial to his longevity. Geriatric science tells us that the moment an old person stops moving, the body begins to shut down. Muscles atrophy, bones become brittle, and the heart weakens. Richard never gave his body permission to stop. The whiskey warmed his muscles, yes, but the work kept them functional. He was constantly bending, lifting, walking, and reaching. He was practicing what we now call functional fitness without ever stepping foot in a gym. He didn't lift weights, he lifted bags of trash. He didn't run on a treadmill. He walked the perimeter of his yard. He treated his home like a barracks, and he was the sergeant in charge of inspection. This sense of purpose, this responsibility to his environment, kept him engaged with the physical world. He wasn't trapped in his mind. He was rooted in the dirt of his front yard. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Richard's daily life, however, was not his physical stamina, but his mental clarity. Heavy, long-term alcohol consumption is notoriously damaging to the brain. It causes cognitive decline, memory loss, and slurred speech. Yet Richard Overton was sharp as a tack, until his final days. He was a storyteller of the highest order. He could recall the specific details of his childhood in the early 1900s, the price of gasoline in 1940, and the names of the men he served with. He could hold court on his porch for hours, entertaining reporters, politicians, and curious strangers with a wit that was quick and dry. The alcohol didn't dull his mind. It seemed to preserve it, pickling his neurons in a state of perpetual good humor. This lucidity was best displayed in his interactions with women. Richard was a legendary flirt. When nurses visited him or when female reporters came to interview him, the old soldier would turn on the charm. He would compliment them, crack jokes, and flash that million-watt smile. He once told a documentary crew, "I like the ladies, and they like me." This wasn't the behavior of a confused old man. It was the behavior of a man who was still very much alive. His libido for life, his desire to connect, to charm, to be seen as a man and not just a patient, was undiminished. He possessed a social intelligence that allowed him to read a room instantly. He knew when to be solemn about the war and when to crack a joke about his whiskey. This mental acuity challenges everything we think we know about healthy aging. We are told that to keep our brains sharp, we must do crossword puzzles and eat blueberries. Richard did neither. He drank bourbon and talked to people. He engaged in the most complex cognitive task available to humans, social interaction. By constantly talking, listening, joking, and remembering, he was exercising his brain just as vigorously as he exercised his legs pushing the lawnmower. The spiked coffee at 3 a.m. was the opening bell for a day of intense cognitive and physical engagement. It didn't numb him to the world. It lubricated his entry into it. It allowed him to bypass the aches and pains that might have kept him in bed, and instead propelled him out the door, into his truck and onto his porch, where he reigned as the most alive man in Austin, Texas. He proved that energy doesn't just come from calories. It comes from spirit, and sometimes a little bit of spirits helps the spirit shine brighter. On December 27, 2018, for the first time in over 70 years, the kettle on Hamilton Avenue did not whistle. The kitchen remained dark. The cats waited by the back door, but the footsteps never came. Richard Overton, the man who had defied the odds, the doctors, and the very concept of time, had finally taken his rest. He was 112 years old. When he passed, he didn't just leave behind a grieving family or a neighborhood that adored him. He left behind a silence. It was the silence of a stopped engine, a machine that had run at full throttle for more than a century and finally, quietly ran out of fuel. The whiskey bottle sat on the counter, corked. The coffee grounds remained in the jar. The ritual was over. But as we stand at the end of his story, looking back at the smoke and the steam, we are left with a question. What was it all for? Why does the image of an old man putting bourbon in his morning coffee resonate so deeply with us? It isn't just because it's funny or because it's a quirky medical anomaly. It resonates because Richard Overton represented a philosophy that we have largely forgotten. In our modern world, we treat life like a museum exhibit, something to be preserved behind glass, kept at the perfect temperature, protected from contaminants, and handled with gloves. We are terrified of scratching the paint. We count our macros, we monitor our sleep cycles, and we worry about the expiration dates on our food. We are so busy trying to extend the duration of our lives that we often forget to inhabit them. Richard Overton didn't preserve his life. He used it. He drove it like he drove his Ford truck with the windows down, one hand on the wheel, and not worrying about the mileage. He understood that the human body is not a temple to be worshipped, but a vessel to be enjoyed. His morning ritual was the ultimate act of ownership. By spiking his coffee, he was claiming the day as his own. He was asserting that his comfort, his pleasure, and his warmth were more important than the rules of medical science. He was living proof that joy is a nutrient, perhaps the most essential one of all. His philosophy on death was as practical as his philosophy on breakfast. He didn't fear the end. He had seen too much death in the Pacific to be intimidated by it. He viewed it with a stoic fatalism that freed him from anxiety. He famously said, "If it's your time to go, that bullet gonna get you. If it ain't your time to go, that bullet's going over your head." This was the bedrock of his peace. He believed that the date of his death was written in a book he couldn't read, so there was no point in trying to edit the pages. If the bullet missed, you didn't spend the rest of the day shaking in fear. You spent the rest of the day drinking whiskey and smoking cigars. You celebrated the miss. Every morning that he woke up at 3 a.m. was a bullet that missed. Every sunrise was a bonus round. And Richard intended to play that bonus round with a full glass. If you walk past his house on Hamilton Avenue today, the energy has changed. The famous front porch, once the most vibrant stage in Austin, is quiet. The metal chair where he held court, where he waved to traffic and flirted with nurses, sits empty. The wind blows through the trees that he planted. The grass grows in the yard that he mowed. The physical presence of the man is gone, but if you listen closely, you can almost hear the faint crackle of a Tampa Sweet cigar. You can feel the warmth of a spirit that refused to be dampened by the tragedies of the 20th century. The house stands as a monument not to a war hero, but to a life lover. It reminds us that while we cannot control the length of our lives, we have absolute control over the width and the depth of them. So how do we honor a man like Richard Overton? We don't need to start drinking whiskey before dawn. We don't need to take up smoking. To copy his habits would be to miss the point. To honor him, we must copy his spirit. We must learn to unclench our jaws. We must learn to worry less about what might kill us and focus more on what makes us feel alive. We must learn to taste the cigar without inhaling the smoke, to acknowledge the bitterness of the world without letting it poison our blood. We must learn to find our own version of the secret ingredient, that small, defiant act of pleasure that makes the burden of existence a little lighter. As the sun sets on this story, we are not left with a medical mystery to be solved. We are left with a permission slip signed by a 112-year-old veteran, authorizing us to enjoy the ride. He showed us that the rules are merely suggestions and that sometimes the experts are wrong. He showed us that a heart fueled by ice cream and bourbon can beat longer than a heart fueled by fear. So here is to the empty chair on the porch. Here is to the Ford truck in the driveway. And here is to the 3 a.m. silence. In your mind's eye, picture that kitchen table one last time. There is a single ceramic mug sitting there. Steam is rising from it, curling into the air, carrying the faint oaky scent of cheap whiskey. Next to it sits an empty shot glass. The chair is pushed back. The man has left the room. But the warmth remains. Fade to black.